Everybody, thank you for joining again the aftermath of the Global Summer Open, where we're doing motion briefings. Right now, we'll be doing the motion briefing for round three, which you can access through the tabs for yourself from the motion tab. Otherwise, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them on the chat as we were doing yesterday, and we'll be answering them during the meeting whenever you are raising them. This will be a bit different from traditional motion debriefs. I'll be going around the basic ideas about what can be explored. I'm not going to go heavily into argumentation because of the paucity of time and give you like run play by play into the argumentation because it will take too much time for us to deal with it. So just going underway then, round three, there's an info slide to the motion. The info slide reads, for the purposes of this debate, fiscal central banking refers to an economic system that grants central banks the mandate to control circulation of money in the economy through fiscal policy in addition to monetary policy. Under this system, central banks can define limitations for the size of the budget, but not its distribution, i.e., they can decide rates for various taxes and limit or increase overall government spending, but can't decide what the money is being spent on. Motion reads, this house would implement fiscal central banking in times of economic crisis. So, couple of things just to remember before we go into like discussing each side. The info slide has a couple of central themes which are associated with it. What essentially does central banking mean? Which means that there is like a requirement for control of funds in any given economy, which is therefore done by some fiscal central banking institution, which has like a lot of policy incentives and a lot of incentives towards driving change through dictating fiscal terms or dictating what fiscal policy in a country should or should not be. So under this particular guise, there is a lot of like additions that need to be done and a lot of like differences that need to be addressed. For example, there can be a limitation in the time of the budget being sent put forth, and there can be a limit in terms of how the budget is being like calculated or run down and how it's going to be like sort of thought about within the policy mandate, but it doesn't really dictate how it's going to be distributed. So what this simply means is that you can probably look at, say, ideas of how the banking system operates in India, where you can increase the interest rates or decrease the interest rates or repo rates. But there is like an always a possibility for different aspects to be like important in terms of how the way the society is operating in terms of how their monetary decisions are being made is being dictated by these financial systems that these banks operate upon. So this fiscal central banking schemes do have a lot of like important considerations, which is why it is also very necessary that most democratic institutions follow some amount of like policy mechanisms through these fiscal central banks. But it does not really like look at how the tax is collected or how it is distributed or how the taxation system is actually collected or what kind of like government spending is actually occurring or what kind of treasury resources are being utilized by the government. So the fiscal bank system only like goes ahead and delineates fiscal policy and does like how economic transitions need to operate are being discussed. So within say like the paradigms of the gov and the op, there are a couple of central themes that you will be sort of like discussing. For the gov, the primary idea about framing would be this way in which how you can become better in terms of like approving different policy mechanisms in the society, but then you will also like have different amount of like leeways which are there in terms of taking rapid decision making systems, and that is what your world building will be solely based on that. What kind of like benefits do central bankings have? What kind of positive traits do fiscal banking systems have? For example, having quick like decision making systems and also like smarter action because people who are trained are taking these actions to begin with, which means that there are larger possibilities for people to have better decision making associations with the judgment calls that they're making. So, in terms of the economic sense, the government can run this idea that there will be much more quicker decision making and there might be swifter action which are taken for like meeting the economic downturns, because this world which we are going to debate the motion on is having like an economic crisis. So when this world is facing an economic crisis, there's a much more increasing need for having like quick policy making and quick like decisions being done for these particular systems to have rapid changes which are accounted and rapid changes which are beneficial in the way in which they're operating. Again, at any point of time, if you have any doubts, please drop a message or in the Zoom chat box or like raise your hand to unmute and I will let you like speak so that we can have um, a discussion much more holistically about what kind of doubts you have on the motions themselves. Now, apart from like the swift decision making systems and how decisive actions can be taken, there can also be like injections which can be made in different areas or sectors, because a fiscal central bank would have a larger decision making or comparative perspective, and they're much more trained to look at the macroeconomics and the microeconomics of the country that they're dealing with, which means that there are larger chances for them to have better judgment calls and better sustainable mechanisms which are associated with these systems. So that being said, the other prong for you to look at in terms of the economic sphere is the idea about how you are reducing the capability that economies have to be uncertain or uncertain like paradigms to deal with, which means that businesses and investors can have more confidence in growing like economic problems, and therefore you can have much more like swifter like ease of decision making, and your central bank can act like a stabilizer where it increases the stability of the economic system. The other thing is that there is always like a probability that the people either underspend during economic crises or just like overspend in certain places when you're say above like a particular fiscal limit. Like if you have say deep pockets, it's much more likely that you're able to spend way more amount of money, right? So I think that can also be something which is like something that fiscal central banking systems do have like a mandate on, and they can quickly take decision makings on basis of these policy incentives that they have to like centralize or decentralize certain mechanisms for leveraging like how the people in the economy are actually spending or not spending. Now, the other things that we can sort of like discuss within the paradigm is that these decisions, which will be like contexted on these ideas, are probably going to be around a lot more like data, because people are much more experienced in making these decisions. These are not decisions which are made by probably politicians or other people who are systematically not really that adept at doing economics or not really that adept at making decision systems in that sense. So there's a larger probability that these data driven decisions can become much more like proactive in terms of taking a stance for how these economies are operating and making these economies more robust in terms of crisis that is there. Also, central banks probably have a lot of like experts which are associated, as I also explained before. So there's a lot more chance for people to have a lot more scope of doing what it needs to be done, which is the right decision to be made, because a lot more like thoughtfulness goes into this decision making system, and a lot more people have the idea about what is going to go ahead and be the best for that economic model to sustain itself during the economic crisis. The other thing that you can sort of like discuss within this idea about how the economy is going to operate is probably how citizens can get better recovery processes, because there is a lot of shorter periods of unemployment, shorter like issues of price in fluctuations, because policy making can keep changing over time so that it can quickly react to market volatility and market inflation to take away some of the problems that come around from these towards the citizens in general. So if you can like prove this idea about how faster recovery can then reduce the pain and scope of like issues that come around for individuals within that space, it is much more likely that trust in institutions increase, and there's a lot more like recovery and other processes that are indicated from this side. Now also, there might be certain places, right, where people have not enough faith in economic decision making of the government, because government sometimes want to pander to their vote bases in terms of making fiscal decisions, which could lead to this problem in terms of trying to do the economic solution which is popular but not really practical or not really like reference towards by experts to be the right course of action. So in that sense, I think it is much more feasible for you to run this idea that a fiscal central bank would not be like catering towards populistic needs and not really having any political inclination towards how they're operating. If you can like properly frame out how these people are going to be elected and put into office in the first place, and what kind of power and authority these institutions would have. So again, just recapping everything that comes around, you will probably be discussing themes around how it can become a much more efficient system. There might be also a very shorter duration of time of responding to the crisis itself, because economic crises need a lot more like quicker resolutions and quicker decision making and quicker like absolution of problems, which means that there is a lot more like probability that people are doing these systems much more better. You can take examples of past crises like the 2008 crisis, where delayed financial decisions by the government had amplified the economic damages that were being presented in the society as a whole, but also like probability of central banks making much more quicker decisions because they have the capability of doing so by having experts and other people who are relevant to the field in those domains. It can also be something which is like the second prong of argumentation that you can run within. So it is also important that in economic crises, the crisis does not repeat itself pretty frequently, and also the crisis is abated as much as possible at the quickest point of time possible. So you can also argue that probably the body that makes the best amount of decisions for these factors and towards making the best decision, which is likely to give the least amount of like time duration towards this crisis, but also like allow people to go through this crisis much more like in stable terms. I think that also comes around in how you frame this particular debate by the idea of how fiscal central banks might be better decision making systems because they have more efficiency and more ability to do these things in the first place. And also, lastly, this idea of fiscal irresponsibility is something that you can probably prevent. So that more or less covers the basic gist of how Gov case would run in this particular motion. If there are any questions, I'll pause for 5 to 10 seconds and then we can start on quickly running down how the opposition would probably like view this motion. Yes, Kishore.
Yeah, hi. Just a question here. So, in status quo, there's no emergency. The fiscal policy is not set by the central banks, right?
So no, the burden is that you're trying to argue why fiscal banks should do it.
Yeah,
So
correct. Just
it's like a
clarifying something.
you're proposing a transition. You're not doing what the status quo dictates. You're providing like an idea about how the status quo will be altered towards having fiscal central banks making the decisions.
Yeah, correct. The question here is that, like, if in status quo, the central bank is not proposing the fiscal policy, it would be like a shift in an emergency, right? Which means, like, how do you guarantee efficiency there?
Simple. I think the idea is to prove on a comparative who is much more likely to make a decision quicker. Is it much more likely that somebody who understands the economic thoroughly is somebody who is going to make decisions quicker versus somebody who does not understand economics but is partly political and has other things to look after in terms of their political interests? So, as I was explaining, for politicians, it's much more easier to take the choice which is much more popular among people rather than what is much more like harder to take or might be the right decision to take in terms of like upholding the spirit of how the economy should operate, but also in terms of what is best for the economy to come around out of this economic crisis to begin with. So on two levels, you can probably argue this. On one, expertise, which means that there's much more likelihood that people with expertise are taking better decisions and are capable of taking these better decisions. The second is this idea about how allegiances lie from both different parties, how fiscal central banking systems have different allegiances versus how, say, political systems have different allegiances to begin with. So if political systems are allegiant towards, say, their voter banks, their entire idea is that they want to get elected again, which means that they'll try to take the decision which would be the least like friction prone within community spaces. For example, this can be something as simple as increasing the tax rate by 1% so that you can have enough amount of financial stability for the governments to run in terms of like economic crises, which means that institutions like, say, healthcare sectors and other sectors which are publicly provided to you by the government would still have some amount of funding to run when there's an economic downturn to begin with and costs are increasing day one day. So this decision is something which is not going to go well with most of the population because of course when people are already facing hardship by economic standards being like problematic in an economic crisis, they are then being forced to pay 1% extra tax, which means that their narrative is shifting towards this idea of making these people face a lot more like economic hardship. In that sense, maybe politicians would not be the people who are acting towards the best interests of how the economy can become better. Instead, they'll try to take a decision which like nullifies this problem that might stem to their voter bank and voter base. So when you're changing the systems and arguing against this, you can probably frame these particular ideas in as to what are the current existing problems in the status quo and how to deal with them in that sense. Does that answer your question, Kishore? Yes. Just a second. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So, like, it mostly answers my question. Just like one small clarification about the example that you talked about. So, you're talking about the government having electoral incentives and like going ahead and increasing taxes by like 1%, and how that would look back to the government, like by the people, right? So, my question here is, if you're going to go ahead and like fund that extra money that you get from these taxes into these healthcare centers, etc., then like when you do the comparison between these two things, like how does that line up? For example, if I don't take this 1%, then the healthcare is probably going to be much worse, right? So even then, the people are probably likely to be like mad at the government or something like that. versus like increasing tax by 1% and making healthcare better. The people are upset with the government for increasing tax by 1%, but they're probably also happy that healthcare is better off.
So I think the thing is about where these funds are coming from. The idea is that, for example, if you can do this without increasing the 1% of tax, and you can sort of like get this idea that you can take the money away from something else. For example, you can take it away from policing budget, put it into healthcare where healthcare systems are bad, but you won't really have to increase the 1% of tax. My example was a hypothetical, of course, it's not like clearly thought out as well as it could have been. But I think there's a lot more like to be said in terms of how we are framing this idea. The idea is that governments have political incentives and are not always having technical knowledge, which is going to like justify the claims or the action that they're taking. Or even if they take those actions, there is much more chances for economic crises to exacerbate a lot more or become much more pronounced because of, say, them taking decisions in consultation with different departments to begin with, because they don't have the idea about how to operate the economic model. So for example, they would probably take the advice of fiscal central banks and then take the decision that they're likely to do if they're rational actors and are saying that probably they'll not be taking the popular choice, they'll be taking the rational choice. Even if that argument is run from the op, there is sort of like a response by saying that there's always going to be like too many cooks in that particular system, and which means that there is a probability of delay occurring in the system in the first place, which could then lead to like a lot of like tangential harms and problems. So there are multiple ways of approaching this issue. The approach is mostly based on these two prongs of technicalities and efficiencies, and then also on the idea of how politicians differ fundamentally in what they prioritize in different spaces. Not always for sure, but most of the times, yes. So, and the average reasonable voter's mind, in case of a comparative you're doing, you could probably dump this as an intuition bomb that right political systems are probably going to be much more unstable when these decisions or these ideas are taken into account. Does that answer your question? Good. Great. Anything else from Gov? Otherwise, we'll move on to the op. None? All right. Moving on to the op case then. A couple of things from op. I think you will probably have like a couple of different quotations about how central bankers would actually work here. Central bankers prioritize macroeconomic principles versus a nuanced understanding of social constructs and social needs of different individuals. So, for example, just on a contrary to what I was mentioning above, there's a larger likelihood towards having social programs which are essential as a social perspective to be cut off like cultural programs and all things, instead of like anything which is like phenomenally going to be affecting the society positively in economic terms is going to be shunned at from the angles of a technicalist or a technical perspective for these economists. Sorry, I have a terrible cold. My throat keeps getting dry, so I'll keep drinking water from time to time. Please pardon me. So the optimal fiscal policy might always not lead to the best results, so which might mean that vulnerable groups who have like some amount of like social benefits that are given to them because they need those particular social benefits because of historical harms or other problems are often disproportionately like affected by these particular policy mechanisms because they're focused upon, say, incentivizing the regrowth of the economy while not really prioritizing any sort of like probability in terms of how social dynamics operate in these systems. This can also look like ideas that probably people below the poverty line, people above the poverty line might have some like similar problems, but the effect of those problems might be more pronounced in people with lower amount of financial capabilities because they don't have the like emergency fund or other things to collapse back upon. So these priorities for the economy might sometimes be forsaken towards like social trends and social issues, and that might be something which is proportionately harmful for vulnerable communities and minority groups in terms of efficiency and on the guise of efficiency. Now, the other prong is probably the availability of distribution mechanisms. So, there might be an argument that can be run from the op paradigm that there is a probability that central banks can set overall limits. But since fiscal central banking through the Infoslide does not intrinsically mean that disbursement of funds occur, it's just that the policy mechanism becomes much more quicker and policy decisions occur much more quicker. There's a likelihood that the constrained government or maybe government decision making is still pretty lapse, and therefore there will be still be a lot of problems and other misaligned priorities which are there, which would mean that there is a lot of like possibility that people will not receive the funds adequately, where there is a much more social need for these funds to be disbursed to them. There might be other incentives for allocation of funds to be deferred, where the same problems that the government is trying to argue here on the idea that people will have like populistic approaches, or governments will have like set priorities and set like requirements. I think that same argument can also be like switched around in opposition paradigm by saying that governments would also, if they're still acting as distributors of these funds, they'll still have problems in terms of like giving these funds away to different people, because the last step is still not fulfilled in this entire chain. The other idea about the economic perspective of this particular motion from the up paradigm is probably the concept of how economic policies need a lot of like public support and buy-in. There's a larger probability that people will revolt against like a fiscal central bank because of a lack of trust or lack of faith, because they don't really know how the system operates. There might also be a lot of like problems because these individuals are unelected. They're probably like professors from reputed institutions, or probably technical specialists from different areas. That might mean that there's a lot of like pushback and harm which is there, which can be leading to public backlash, issues of non-compliance in policy mechanisms by different like public users. And there might also be like social unrest and causes of political and social concern within the central systems that are going to operate within these ideas. So that becomes the economic perspective that you can sort of like discuss. The second prong about, say, how the legitimacy and how the operation of the central bank is operating. So there might be a lot of like mm, mudslinging across the board, because now if you're at the forefront of political decision making and so on and so forth, the central bank then becomes part of a lot of political debates. They're going to be thrown into the media space. They're going to be called out and questioned by a lot of people. There might be like a question about how the independency and legitimacy of of this institution will work, because this institution is supposed to be apolitical. But when you're going so intrinsically into political decision making and say policy making initiatives, it's much more probable that people's lives will be directly like affected, which might mean that there might be some amount of like questions which are drawn into how these systems and institutions are operating and how these problems are going to be occurring. Now, accountability becomes the second issue, because you do not really have elected officials who you can throw out by, say, a referendum or a vote of no confidence or something around that line. So this idea about accountability becomes really questionable. So if, for example, there is a problem in terms of how the decision making is done or how the systems are being run, it's a more probable case that accountability is not really something which can be there. So the democratic deficit in terms of like them not being elected individuals become like very simple towards arguing towards how these people can be infallible and unapproachable at the same time. So transparency and accountability become two other prongs of issues that come around from how these central banks are perceived in the world. The other idea that you can possibly run about how the image of the central bank or this idea of the central bank is operating is this question around how like this ivory tower syndrome would occur, which simply means that people sitting in high levels would not really understand how low level systems operate, which might mean that their broader fiscal mechanisms, which was also the idea that we were having for economies and how those scales are operating, would become much more inconsequential and like towards like individuals in a lower like economic background, which might mean that these individuals are facing a lot more problems and harms which are probable upon them. So that is a very primary concern which is to be dealt with. I think that becomes a huge problem, because for economic crises, the best amount of action is done on macroeconomic policy instead of microeconomics, which means that there would be a larger prioritization of macroeconomics, which might mean that there might be people like small businesses or very small retailers, very small people in service sectors, people who are daily wage laborers, and other people who don't really have the traditional source of gaining income will face a lot of hardships and issues, because they are not really like set out towards um, getting the most amount of benefit out of these systems. So the impact on real people and businesses might be something that these particular economists are not really going to have like a lot of like clarity upon and like discussions upon. Now the other two prongs are on how governments and politics work and how citizens work. So, in governments and politics, I think there's a lot of promotion of this concept of erosion of democratic sovereignty, which means that, like, the very essence of having a parliamentary democracy where people have elected leaders who are doing certain actions, are doing certain steps, have been undermined towards a long extent because of these like takeovers by fiscal institutions, which are not going to be elected or not going to be representative of how the voters are voting to put these people as elected officials in these spaces. So these particular issues might lead to political instability. Responsibility might be abdicated towards these individuals. Elected officials will not really think very critically on what is needed or what is to be done. So in this sense, also when the government is having these erosions of responsibility and probability harms that are going to be associated, citizens can also feel like a lot of unfair burdens are being placed on them. So there might be larger growth of public unrest and public dissentiment towards how these systems are operating. There's also like a problem that authoritarianism in terms of fiscal policy making might be something which is going to be much more highlighted and much more concernable towards different individuals and different aspects. So majorly around op world, these are the arguments that you will run, and more or less those are the discussions that you will have in terms of having these discussions of fiscal policy within, say, the ambit of the round three motion. If there are any questions from opposition's paradigm or in general any questions for this particular round, I will be happy to take them right now. If there are none, otherwise we'll proceed. Yes, Kishore.
Yeah, okay, just one clarification about status quo. So right now, if the government itself sets fiscal policy, then like who does it consult before going in and setting this policy? Is it the central bank itself, or like does it have separate experts who it goes and consults?
I couldn't get your question because you were breaking off towards the end. Could you just repeat?
Yeah, okay. Am I audible now?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
All right, cool. So right now in status quo, let's say you don't have an emergency, then the government probably goes ahead and sets the fiscal policy, correct?
Yeah.
So if it does go ahead and set the fiscal policy right now, then who does it go and consult? Does it have a fixed set of experts that it consults, or does it consult the central bank in itself?
Central bank gives a lot of like decision making systems as like suggestions. So probably they'll like write reports and such and stuff. The other thing is that there are like economic like communities and not communities, probably the better term is committees. So there is like fiscal committees, there's a budget committee, and there are so many people in the political systems which form committees and have people in the executive who are working for them, who are like, for example, the financial secretary and so on and so forth. And these executionary functionaries, along with like the central bankers and everybody in that ecosystem, sort of like sit together, and these committees come to decisions by discussing different things and aspects. So it's more like a collaborative process, which is why I told you, right? It takes a lot more time for these things to actually come around and happen because these people will have to take decisions by consulting with a lot of different individuals in a lot of different spaces. So that's one of the ways in which it operates. Any other questions? None? All right. Let's take a 3 minute break or 5 minute break. I need to drink some water and get my throat fixed up. We can start with motion four for round four after that. And then we'll sort of wrap up just beyond that.